Is there a strategy that'll help you grow your company faster? CEO Sales Strategies is an investigative business podcast for entrepreneurial people who never stop asking questions. Highly acclaimed sales revenue growth expert Doug C. Brown interviews CEOs, business owners, and professionals who serve them to uncover and share actionable tips and methods behind their bulletproof sales strategies. Topics covered on the show include their failures, struggles, secrets, and processes that help them succeed in selling millions to billions of dollars of their products and services, all with the sole aim of helping you grow your business. If you are eager to know the most effective sales secrets from the A players of the game, then the CEO Sales Strategies podcast is certainly the place to be.
Hey everyone, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. I have another great guest. His name is Mr. Jim Simpson. He has a company called Blumira. Blumira, they're at blumira.com, and he's the CEO of the company. We're going to talk today about how to use culture and valuing employees on how you can raise your revenues in the company and why it's so important. This guy's fascinating. He's got a lot of very interesting things to say. And I was taking copious notes throughout the process because I was learning so much from him. I mean, he's built companies, up into 800 employees, and they sold off to, large companies like Cisco. And they used culture and valuing the employees as the bedrock, or as part of the bedrock of actually growing the company. So believe it or not, you have a culture in your company, whether you like it or not. It's just the way it is. Now, your culture can be very supportive. Your culture can be non-supportive. I bring up an example of a company, as we were talking about, where I find the culture has been shifting and the end user experience is shifting. And I'd be interesting to see where their revenues are going to go over time. I know they've been having some revenue challenges, and I believe in part it's because of the cultural shift that's going on. The employees in this company, not Jim's, another company, which we all know, which I will name in the podcast, has been shifting. And I think that's causing people not to want to go and buy from this particular company. So we're going to start with the culture, then we're going to shift, believe it or not, to cybersecurity, because Blumira is a cybersecurity company which handles small and medium-sized businesses and makes it affordable. And I wanted to get some cybersecurity considerations in on this podcast for you, because a lot of times smaller and medium-sized companies, they don't pay attention to this because it's not cost effective, and Blumira is able to make it cost effective. But when we neglect these things, they can come back and bite us. I know I've had it happen to me as well in my companies. So anyways, that's why I bring it forth. Let's go talk to Jim right now. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Get a pen and paper or digital notepad. Take some notes. Here we go. Hey, Jim, welcome to the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. Thanks so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about culture today and valuing employees. And I think it's one of those things that people go, yeah, that's a great idea, but how does it help me grow my business, right? So if somebody was saying that, like, hey, Jim, you know what? I mean, you've been from startup to 5 billion, a billion. I mean, you've been all over. How does value your employees and building on a culture actually create revenue growth in a company?
That is, I love this question because where I saw this happen was at my last company called Duo Security. And we had a CEO, a fellow named Doug Song, who was very intentional about culture. And what was interesting is when we were like 30 employees, 50 employees, it was really hard to tell what culture was because startup days are chaotic. It's like, being in a pirate ship and you're, on the rough seas. And it was really hard to tell in those early days. But how it manifested itself later was a hugely successful company where, in spite of having almost 800 employees when we exited, still felt very, very familial, very low egos throughout the organization. And I mean, if you looked at our P&L, you would have been shocked at how well we were doing. And so for me, it was not just the fact that we were hugely successful. It was how we were hugely successful. And I think the other interesting thing is there's this expectation of, people have this idea of startup versus corporate. And how do you define corporate? Is it the size of company? Is it a way of doing things? But the fascinating part for me about that culture was when we got to 800 people, I'd say we were a corporate org. We had plenty of G&A. We had all sorts of processes, like our finance people were doing finance things, but we didn't feel like we were a big company, but we were definitely punching at a big company level, and it felt like we were still a small company. And so that's, to me, like the reality of when you have a great culture, it drives results, and it just feels like you're having a lot of fun in the process. So and the results follow. We had a great product, but we wouldn't have had that great product if we hadn't had a great culture. And because we had a great product, we had great sales. And because we had great sales, we could actually continue to build on it. So
that makes a lot of sense. You said something really cool here, and I want to come back at it because every person I talked with, maybe minus two, have always wanted a small company feel in a big company. They wanted to feel like they mattered in some capacity, right? And when you get to a certain size company, I won't name names of companies I've worked with, but they didn't know they had a division or another manufacturing plant 50 miles from where they were because they were just so big. And so a lot gets lost and people feel like they're a number. Now, 800 employees is a very good sized company, right? I mean, it's not 150,000 employees, but it's still a really good sized company. How does one build? I guess I'll ask it this way, Jim. How did you do it? How did you pull it off? Because I know a lot of people are thinking like that.
Yeah, first of all, I really do think a lot of it has to do with your leadership and repetition of the stated goal of building culture and using that to infer every touch point with the organization. So a number of the things that went into that were our company had biannual kickoffs when we were a small company, like every 6 months, because we felt that as when we were a startup, things were changing so often, we needed to get everybody together, have a conversation about everything that was changing so that everybody could stay on the same page. And in those kickoffs, we always made sure every part of the organization had some kind of voice. And then sometimes we would do really cool things like get a panel of people from different parts of the organization and then ask them all what their perspectives are about something that we were doing, both positive and negative, to really sort of like, create this idea that we were one team. And another thing that went into it was as we became multi-site, we were really intentional about like where did we locate activities, and then we also made sure that our leadership were going between those sites on a very consistent basis so that we could bring the culture there. We also were really thoughtful about how did we time things, because we had our headquarters were in Michigan, but we had an office in California and we also had an office in London. And so we were always thinking about, okay, like when do we time certain events so that we can actually make sure everybody is able to participate? Because being inclusive across the organization was really important. I think the other part about it, which is pretty interesting, so I'm talking a lot about bringing people together. There was this really strong idea about pushing decision making down. And it's just one way of saying, like, how do you empower people? How do you make them autonomous in their roles? And in my career, I hear people often say like, oh, I want to be strategic. And then sometimes you give them that opportunity and they balk at it because they're like, oh my gosh, like being strategic is actually really hard. Like I want somebody to tell me what to do because I'm scared, right?
Right.
So the flip side of that notion of pushing decision making down was like learning together, creating the support and the structure so that people could grow. We had our own like culture day that everybody would go through on a monthly basis so they could learn about like what we believed in, how we did things, what the history of the company were, how do we do meetings, all of those things to really kind of create our own consistent culture. And we operationalized it. Like in big companies, you'll find that, finance is in its own area, HR is in its own area. But what we did was we made sure that everybody was doing their role as best as they possibly could. So we had a lot of specialists in all of these different departments, so you could learn to depend on people for certain things as well and remain connected. It evolved too. It wasn't on day one we figured this out, but we were definitely every quarter, every year, we were checking in like, how do we continue to build on this, because we don't want to lose it.
You said like, I'm writing note after note after note feverishly. So here's what I heard. You haven't had an inclusive environment throughout, because you had an 8-hour time span between London and the Pacific Coast. So, and I know from doing a lot of events, that's hard to pull off, right? It really is. People go, well, what are you talking about? It's really hard to pull off between 8 hours, especially, in a corporate workday. And you were allowing decision making to be pushed down, so people felt autonomous and felt a sense of responsibility, I bet, and pride in the fact that they could make decisions, where most companies are not so, you don't have the ability to do so. I'll say it at that point, right?
Yeah.
And leadership. Now, what I got out of this was you had a leadership team that actually actively worked on this. And so let's say there's a company, they're doing, I don't know, $15 million today, right? They've just been slugging it out, getting there. They really don't have the culture, but they want to kind of pull the culture together today. I mean, everybody has a culture, but it's not really a well thought out strategic culture like I'm hearing that you did. Where do they start? Like, or they're, I don't know, they're a startup company, or they're, doing 50 million and their culture isn't what they want it to be.
First, I'd be really impressed that they got to those numbers if they hadn't thought about that, because it's hard to do, with if you aren't thinking about culture. So I'd say congratulations to them. Then second, I would say like, okay, well, you have this opportunity now to like turn that into something even bigger by focusing on your people. And what I would do is I would ask them a lot about like how. So first of all, do they call it HR? Or do they call it people? Because I think that there's something about that. In the early days of Duo, we called it people and culture on purpose, because we wanted to focus on the fact that there was a culture aspect to it. We also looked for people who had high EQ for those functions, who could look at the organization and kind of see like, how is it going? How are people feeling? How are they doing? And we had a people ops team who was dedicated to focusing on building out that culture. So I would try to see like, how are they actually facilitating it? Is HR just one of those things where it's, HR ops, where you're just focusing on like making sure people get their benefits and what have you? Or like, are they thinking about like, oh my gosh, we should have a management training thing that we send everybody to? We should be getting people together on occasion to go through what our values are. We should have a way for people to give praise to each other. Like, are they doing any of those things? Are they doing any lightweight things? Like, we called it coffee roulette at my last gig, and I think we call it a coffee chat here at Blumira, but effectively a way to match up different employees across the organization so that they can meet with each other. And I participate in that. Like, I am not above anybody in my organization. I want to hear from them, and I want to know who they are, what they're doing. And, a lot of times we get to talk about personal stuff, but a lot of times people are like, ooh, I'm with the CEO, I'm going to ask really hard questions. And I think that probably would lead maybe to another thing, which is the transparency. Like, how much, do you tell your folks to create those kinds of culture? Because in leadership, you're in that hard spot of like, you need to tell people enough so that they could be effective. You want to tell them enough to be transparent. And then there's all of the other stuff that's really challenging, but you have to be intentional about that transparency and give people enough and trust that they're going to do good with it. And that will then go on to the next layer or generation of folks that comes into the organization.
We're speaking with Mr. Jim Simpson. He's the CEO of a company called Blumira, and we're going to be talking about the company in a bit. Jim, you're the type of guy that like, I'm unemployable, but I'm going, man, I would love to work for this guy. It's
thank you.
But yeah, I mean, it's awesome to hear and refreshing to hear CEOs talk like this. And I've been finding this, I don't want to pick on like certain companies because I don't want to get sued like Amazon or Whole Foods. But I've been finding lately when I go into say Whole Foods, because where we shop, that the culture has actually shifted. And the employees there are now talking, I'm going to say quasi disparaging type of conversation, right? They're not as happy. I hear them commiserating behind the counters. And I can feel the shift in the culture going on within the company. And again, I'm not picking on the company or singling it out. It's just something personally that I was there yesterday and I was like, you know, they usually have a really good customer service logo up on the wall. And I'm like thinking, man, nobody's living into this mission any long, you know, in this place, right? So if a company is at a huge, gigantic level and they're kind of slipping with the culture or they're transitioning away from what they deem the employees to be valued, how will somebody possibly pull that back? Have you ever been in that position?
Yeah. Well, so you know, what that makes me think about is, again, like the leadership, and you know, you have to like look at the values of the leadership. You know, the CEO has a lot of things that they can do. And one of them is to choose to be intentional about it. And when we, you know, look at the historical values of, say, like a Whole Foods versus an Amazon, there is a difference there. And once you become part of that parent company, unless something is very explicitly decided, and you know, decided in the terms of the contract, you are likely to be subject to whatever the culture is that you're going into. And you know, we did have an exit at Duo. We got acquired by Cisco, which is an 80,000 person company. It's, you know, a Silicon Valley, you know, figurehead. Like, it's been around for a very long time, very, very successful company. And, but, you know, not traditionally a software company, and not necessarily a security software company. They've done a lot of security software acquisitions over the years, but you know, much of their business still comes from hardware. And you know, we got to witness how acquisitions went for other parts of the organization versus how it went for us. And what I'm proud to say is that, you know, more or less what remains of Duo Security inside of Cisco is the R&D team. And I'd say the R&D team had a really, really strong culture. And what's fascinating to me is I do believe that the Duo product is still one of the highest performing things in their software portfolio. So that part demonstrates to me that culture can still drive results post-acquisition. Now, the downside is I would say that management on the Duo side has a more challenging time because of the difference in culture between the Cisco and Duo. And, you know, you're fighting 30 years of culture there. I think what's really interesting about Cisco is the very top of the organization, the executive leadership team is interested in making changes to culture. But when you're in an organization that size, even with the best of intent, things move a lot more slowly than you might want, which is why folks like me jump off to startups because we like to be in little, like, you know, fast pirate ships. We're not necessarily interested in being on a comfortable cruise ship, although every once in a while I look at my, you know, tax returns and think, oh gosh, those were fun days at Cisco, right? So, you know, there's pros and cons to it all. And in fact, I had a former employee of mine who left Cisco to go off to a startup, and he's had some, you know, challenges. And, you know, as a mentee of mine, we were chatting about what his opportunities were. And I said, look, you really got to decide what you want the next phase of your career to be. And because he was afraid, like, well, if I go work at Cisco again, isn't that like, you know, I've failed? And I'm like, no, like, if you want a great place that's stable with good benefits and you want to learn to become a manager, you have got so many people there who are going to help you. Like, it is not losing. It's actually like doing a great thing. And sometimes you got to go out there and get perspective to see what you really want to do. So none of this is bad, right? So like, but it's, you know, I would say that it, you know, it was challenging, and some departments within Duo who migrated to other parts of Cisco didn't, you know, they don't exist anymore because the parent culture was just too strong for them to persist inside of it. So
I'm going to kind of deviate here because there's a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast, and you just said something like, I don't even know if you know how brilliant that was. Like, it's like, maybe you did. We'll see. But here's what I got.
My mother would be a big fan of yours, by the way.
Well, tell her I said hello. Thank you. So a lot. I've talked with many, many, many entrepreneurs who worked, and I did too. I worked for major companies and I went out. It went okay in some cases. Some cases it just imploded. And I went back to the company to regroup, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I learned so much from that experience of it imploding and then going back and then having that full different perspective. As you, I think that's the word you just used. And I think that is kind of a growth phase for people to capitalize on it and be, if they take the exact attitude you just said. Look, it's not a failure. You know, you had a bump in the road, and if you're going to be an entrepreneur, there's going to be bumps. That's just the way it goes. It's part of the game. So I think that was like brilliant advice for people. If you don't succeed the first time, it's okay. You know,
Agreed. Yeah.
it, in fact, I would argue it's part of the process of becoming a very successful entrepreneur to make mistakes. And as painful as they can be, right? So
totally.
So Jim, right now you're the CEO of a company called Blumira, and they are a cybersecurity company. Why don't you tell people what they do? Because it's pretty cool what you guys do.
Okay, so we're going to do a quick pop quiz here. I think we might have done this before, but I'm just going to ask you again. How many days do you think it takes for a company to detect and remediate a breach on average?
A breach? I would say, well, the IT guy in me should say, oh, it takes 24 hours, but I know it's longer than that. It's I don't know, 10 days, 5 days, 10 days. I'm not really sure.
Well, with Blumira, you could do it in 24 hours, but the average is over 280 days. It's like 212 to detect it and 70 something to remediate it on average. And it's come down over the years, but that's pretty long period of time. And the challenge is that a lot of the tools that are out there aren't built for, they're built for really big organizations that have the resources to bring to bear to operationalize them from, you know, cost perspective and a staffing perspective. But there are a lot of companies out there who don't have security people. Security people are expensive, they're in demand, and they might be lucky if they have an IT person or two. So what Blumira does is it helps those small organizations prevent, detect, and remediate breach before it happens to them. And because we're focused on a small business, it's really critical to make it super easy, like easy to, you know, buy, easy to set up, easy to operate, and easy to manage, and ideally also really easy to interact with us. And so that's what our mission is to help those small organizations avoid getting breached, but if they do, help them solve it even faster than is in the market.
So if I heard you correctly, 280 days, I was just doing a little math in my head. That's like 9.3 months, 9.2 months or something. Your data's gone by then, right? I mean, it's like
yeah, there's a lot that happens. And like you know, so whenever I read about, you know, a big organization getting breached, I just feel for the people who have to work in security and IT there, because they're probably doing their very best, and it's really challenging, especially in large organizations, but even smaller organizations too, you know. And but since there's a lot of folks out there, a lot of vendors out there who already focus on the upper part of the market, you know, my career has been, you know, for the last decade or so, focusing on like, how do you bring security solutions to the underserved population in IT? So Duo was all about multi-factor auth. This is, I think, another level of complexity, but fortunately for us, like the technology is here for us to do it. So I'm really excited about like what we can do. And I think the thing that's really interesting to me is when we have customers, number one, they usually don't leave us. And, you know, we've had 100% CSAT score since we've been measuring it for the last year. And in SMB, that's like amazing. But like, again, if you want to talk about culture and like how that informs things, this is how it manifests itself. And it's possible to do this. So I'm excited to see other organizations, you know, go down this path too, because there's a lot of people, a lot of companies out there who need help.
So when you're talking about SMB, like small business, small, medium-sized business, are we talking about companies that are like, can anybody use I mean, because here's the reason I'm asking this question. A lot of companies who are smaller or mid-sized companies, they don't think that they're ever going to get breached.
Yep.
You know what I mean? I mean, until it happens.
Yeah, until it happens. So you've hit the nail on the head. So for us, the way we sell our product, we sell directly to customers, and probably the biggest challenge there is market awareness. So, do they know that there's an issue, and if they do they know how to solve that? And the other way we do it is indirectly through a channel through MSPs, where we see a lot of success because, fortunately, for the people who consume their services through MSPs are very savvy and smart and are like, oh, this is a good security thing. And so the MSP has peace of mind that their customers aren't going to get breached, but then the customers are benefiting. For us, like the number one competitor when we're dealing with direct customers is do nothing, because they haven't been breached. And so there's a lot of work to be done there on the education side, which is pretty common when you're going into a market that hasn't been tapped before with a product.
So MSP, what does it stand for?
It stands for managed service providers. So it's very common for like very small businesses to use an MSP to outsource their IT, so they don't have to have that IT person, and someone can handle Google and Zoom and all of that stuff for them. But increasingly, we're actually seeing even larger companies begin to take advantage of MSPs. And traditionally, MSPs just focus on the IT side of things. So Blumira is a really interesting tool for them because it is a security tool that's actually built for IT folks. And so they get it immediately, and it's so easy for them to get up and running. It creates value for both of them and their customers.
So if I'm a small company, like I am, right, and I get breached, what are some of the downs? Like, I mean, we all know, like, it's funny. Last night I was talking to my two daughters, and they're like, we don't want to go to a cashless society because I don't want to wake up one day and find out I have no money left in the bank, right? It's
right.
And I found that from they're 21 and 23, and I found that from a perspective of a young mind, like just kind of like, wow, right? Because I remember when ATMs came out, the older folks wouldn't put their money in there because they thought it would eat it and never get their money back, right? So, but I'm a small company, or I'm small to medium sized company. What kind of damage could result from a cyber a security break?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different things. Probably the most common thing we see is ransomware, where a company will basically, they not be allowed to operate until they pay a certain amount of money to whoever's holding them hostage. And it's a little different. Like if you're getting into specific verticals, like say if you get into healthcare, well, HIPAA has fines for if people's like personal information gets stolen, and so they're targets because the value of those fines is so high that they can command a pretty high ransom. But we've seen some prospects and customers run into this over the years, and it's really surprising to them when it happens, but really anybody can be a victim at this point. It's just whether or not someone decides to knock on the door and see if anybody's there to do something about, and you just don't know when it's going to happen. And I don't really like talking about it from the fear and uncertainty and doubt, but based on what I've seen, there is no safe place. It's just a question of when, and is there any perceived value to the company that somebody could take advantage of?
And could it be where their employees are actually looking online that creates these issues?
Can you give me an example?
Well, I was working with
What
a
do you mean by that?
wireless security company one time, and I was shocked at the statistics of how many men and women, view porn and go on to online betting sites and things like this.
Oh, yeah. So accidental, I'd say, like, so a good example of that is like somebody like, especially with remote work. So say somebody's at home, they look at something on their computer that installs some kind of Trojan or virus onto it, but they're also doing work for their company. All of a sudden, you've got a situation where somebody might be able to get into corporate because somebody is working from home. And there's a whole philosophy on how you want to manage that proactively called zero trust, where you don't trust people's laptops or desktops or them until they prove and validate that they are who they say they are and that the computer is up to date and has no viruses. But it's a challenging architecture to roll out. And so we're kind of like on the other side of that, where we're like, hey, if something does happen, we're going to point it out to you before it gets too bad so you can do something about it. But yeah, absolutely. And most of the time people aren't like, nobody who works for an organization intentionally sets up their organization for failure. There's just a lot of points in technology where these things can happen, especially as we've gone remote.
Well, and I think that would be huge for like a CEO just to protect themselves, because I mean, even the fallout, PR fallout of certain things that could happen on, I mean, every time we see somebody was, a big company was breached, it hits the news for sure, right?
Yeah.
But even smaller company, I mean, I wouldn't want to be, the CEO, the presidents of banks or whatever, and then find out my place was breached and, have to deal with that fallout of the PR issue for sure. Or an attorney firm or anybody who has a fiduciary relationship, I think they ought to take a really good close look at it. And I know, and the reason I'm saying this, Jim, is because I know a lot of companies who are smaller, i.e., 50 employees, they tend not to look at this. They go, it's
right,
an
because they think they're flying under the radar, and
right.
I totally get it. I've also seen companies like that get breached, unfortunately, and like that's the hard part. And there's a whole industry built around like, what do you do post breach, called incident response, and that's paying people to figure out how to fix it all for you. So it's there we need to educate people a little bit more about the dangers that are out there. But it also, the other thing is like, it shouldn't be terribly expensive to do this either. And so that's the other part of what we're trying to do here, is make this affordable for those small organizations to do so, because traditionally the vendors that are out there are quite expensive when it comes to providing solutions for organizations.
Makes sense. Jim, if people want to get a hold of the company, do they go to Blumira, BLUMIRA.com, or do they go somewhere else? Or
Yep, that's right, Blumira.com. And also, if you want to, you can sign up for a free trial there. We allow you to protect your Microsoft 365 environment. We'll give you some insights so you can try the product out. But the entire idea there is like, most organizations are using Microsoft 365. There's a lot of really good data that you can use to determine whether or not you're doing okay. And so we want people to try that out, see it. And if they find value in it, feel free to call us up, or maybe we'll reach out to you and see if there's more you want to do with us.
Yeah, because I saw that on the site that was like no credit card down or something like that, right?
Yeah, you want to make it really easy for people to try stuff out. It's like, I mean, I think, we put ourselves in the shoes. It's like, I don't know if you're ever going to a website, you're like, oh, I'm going to try this thing out. They're like, please enter a credit card. And you're like, how do I feel about this? I don't know these people. And you don't want that barrier. You want people to be like, I'm going to try it out. If they get value, great. If they don't get value, no harm done.
Sounds great. Jim, thanks so much for being on the CEO Sales Strategies podcast today. Thanks for bringing your A game. And I'd love to have you back on another show. We'll dive deeper into the security side or whatever.
You're welcome, and it has been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care. All right. So, what'd you learn? I learned a lot. If you're going to create a culture, it starts with leadership. We all know this, but how many of you are actually proactively taking time and building meetings in with your team, your executive staff, or your upper level management on how to build your culture? That is the key. I was telling Jim, I worked for a company, it's called Paytech Communications, and a man named Arunas Chasonis was the CEO of that company, and the executive team was amazing. And we built that company up, and I say we because we all worked there. And that company eventually sold off for a couple $2 billion, right? And our stock shares were happy at that point. But we were all happy to be there. And Jim creates an organization and a company where people are happy to be there. It's been a long time since I've worked for a company, and I was thinking through this process, my gosh, if I had met this man, I would have gone to work for him. And I worked very, very long, hard hours for a lot of different companies, and I would have done the same for him and made them tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in sales every single year. Why would I do that? Because part of the culture makes us want to do that. You probably have been in an environment in the past where you're like, my gosh, this is just amazing. I just want to be here. I'm so into being here. Hopefully that's in a significant relationship in your life, and you still feel that way, right? And when you're at work, when you feel that way, your employees, it transcends into the business. transcends into the people buying from you, and they can feel it. Have you ever been to an organization where you're like, man, these people are just happy to be here, and I'm happy to be here buying from them? It's infectious. We can't help ourselves. And so create your culture, create the values around there, and value your employees, especially today where things are going on more than ever. Value your employees. And that doesn't mean you don't fire people. That doesn't mean that you don't move people to new places. It just means value them, because that's what they're looking for. Speaking of value, cybersecurity. If you haven't looked at cybersecurity in your company, and you're a small, medium-sized business, or you're a large business, please do so. It only takes one instance to really cause a lot of damage within the architecture of your company, number one. Impede sales processes. It can be a PR nightmare too. I know even my companies, I've had a couple of them where we had some cybersecurity issues, and people just got in there and got past the firewalls and did all that stuff back, especially when it wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. And, we've learned. So please don't learn the hard way. The easy way is a lot easier to learn. If you want to check out Blumira, please do so as well. As always, if you love this subject, please go give it a 5-star review. If you have a subject that you may be an expert on, or somebody is an expert and they might want to be on the CEO Sales Strategies podcast, please send them our way, or come our way, by yourself. Send an email into youmatter, youmatter, at ceosalesstrategies.com, and we'll be happy to review, and we will answer all inquiries. If you have somebody, yourself or someone who wants to be in the top 1% of earners through selling, let us know, and send me an email at doug@ceosalesstrategies.com. Or if you want to just optimize and build a revenue in your company, we can help you out. Once again, I want to thank you for being here and listening to the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. Please tell friends. The more people who listen, the more people we can help, and the more we grow as well. And I'd be truly grateful. As usual, go out today and sell something. Sell a lot of it. Make some friends. Play win-win. Make them happy. You're happy. They're happy with your product or service. You're happy that you have a new customer or a repeat customer, and you've made some additional funds, and it's a win-win play. Until next time, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast, saying to your success.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. What is something that you learned that you could act on today? Don't forget to schedule it now, or it may never get forward momentum. If you find our content valuable, please leave a favorable review and let us know what you liked. Please also share this with others if the content will help them. For our show notes, other episodes, and more interesting content and resources, please visit ceosalesstrategiespodcast.com. See you soon, and to your continued success.